Hello, my name is Ian, and I use he, him pronouns. And it is time for us to have a conversation about the pronouns we use for God. Something that might be a little more important than at first you might think it is. And yes, it's Pride Month, and that's why we're doing this. And I've got some thoughts about pride. Some things I don't like about it that if you stick around to the end, you'll hear me share my thoughts on. But first we have to go on this journey. This journey that we go on each week on this show. The journey that takes us out of our comfort zone, along paths that we may not go on our own. Let's take that journey, shall we? Here on The Marginal Way.
Here's to all the misfits. We belong. And when the same old voices say that we'd be better off running away, we belong, we belong anyway.
God is queer, as in strange, surprising, titillating, non-conforming to norms that destroy. God is queer, as in breaking open new possibilities through flesh entangled and brave acts of collective courage. God is queer, as in troubling certainties, resisting assimilation, and persisting through struggle together. God is queer, as in interdependence, chosen family, and reaching out to isolated kin. God is queer, as in always becoming. God is queer, as in less this or that, and more multi-layered, multi-dimensional, and complex. God is queer, as in intimately experienced and beyond definition. God is queer, as in the love between strangers and sheets, the love that lasts for lifetimes, the love that begets love. God is queer, as in resist white supremacy and all its deadening lies, rigid definitions, and desire to control and confine. God is queer, as in loyal to love, lovers, beloveds, and even when it's all on the line. God is queer, as in hurtful when spit from the mouth of hate, but sometimes still also a lighthouse, a history of holy uprising, and a coming home from within. Earlier this week, as I was out chasing a mega rarity, a crested cara for those who are keeping score at home, and did not find it, but ran into some other birders, as one is wont to do when birding for a rare bird. You run into people who are doing the same thing. And as we were waiting and watching, we heard a bird. And we couldn't quite make it out. At first, we thought it was a willow flycatcher. But as we listened, it wasn't quite doing Fitzbew. It was doing more of a free beer. And so we came to the conclusion that it was not a willow flycatcher after all, but it was an alder flycatcher. And these two flycatchers in the Empidnex family are extremely hard to tell apart. So hard to tell apart that when bird banders have one in their hand, if it doesn't sing, or they don't have any other way of knowing where it came from, perhaps a nest or something like that, they are stuck with banding it with a band that says that it's a trails flycatcher, the name of the species before it was split in two. Isn't it interesting that a bird can be so sure of itself that it sings its song, even though we impose upon it an identification? Sounds far too much like what's happening to our transgender siblings these days, isn't it? People so sure of what a person ought to be, who a person ought to be, how a person ought to be, that we impose an identity upon them. Perhaps it is time, perhaps it's well past time for us to listen to the people who know themselves the best, the individuals. Listen and let them sing their song, and name them by what they sing and who they truly are.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face was distorted. He ordered the furnace heated up 7 times more than was customary, and ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to throw them in the furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But the 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down, bound, into the furnace of blazing fire. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up quickly. He said to his counselors, Was it not 3 men that we threw bound into the fire? They answered the king, True, O king. He replied, But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the 4th has the appearance of a god. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace of blazing fire and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their tunics were not harmed, and not even the smell of fire came from them. Nebuchadnezzar said, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God.
They say you should choose wisely what hill you're willing to die on. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were willing to die on the hill of claiming their identity, right? They were Jews who would not bow to a human. Only to God would they show that kind of honor and respect. And that seems like a rather small hill to choose, doesn't it? When you think about that, they could have spared their lives and gone on and done much good by simply bowing down to the king. It doesn't sound like a difficult price to pay. So it leads me to believe that what the king was imposing upon them for just being who they were had to be something horrific, something horribly threatening. Which makes me think about the LGBTQI plus community today. For just being who they are, they're asked to pay a price. Standing up, being proud of who they are is a bold step, a brave step. And for some, it is a life-threatening stance. And so it's not a stretch to see that community being these three men standing in the fire and not being consumed. It's a great message of hope. And the message of hope really rests on the fact that when those around look into the fire, they see a fourth, not three, but four standing there, which many interpret as the presence of God, which is a good interpretation. But in this metaphor of standing up as an ally, as an advocate today, perhaps we are called upon to be God's hands and feet. We are called to be God's ambassadors, standing alongside those who are being oppressed. And maybe we're to be that fourth person in the fire. For as long as there have been Christians speaking and writing about God, that language has referred to God almost exclusively as he, him, his. And I'm here to say, that's acceptable. It's all right. And the reason it's all right is that the language forced it, right? If you're speaking in Greek about a table, you need to choose if it's a he or a him or a she or a her, or same thing is true of a tree or of any other object. There are genders baked into the language. So it makes sense that we have that. And I'm also going to tell you that I think it's okay to think of God as male, because God is male and female, and non-binary, and transgender, and every expression of gender imaginable. Now, why do I say that? I say that because we understand from our ancient story right at the beginning that we humans are made in the image of God. Well, that must mean that every expression of being human is contained within the divine. That every expression of how we are, who we are, what we do has to be contained in how God is and even what God does. So perhaps the time has come for us to start to use new pronouns for God. More than 30 years ago, I began the journey of stopping using the limiting he pronoun for God. I just won't do it because that's putting God in a box of gender that God won't fit in. And when I started that practice, one of the things that happened was every time I'd come up on the need to make a change in my language, I'd have to stop and think. It wasn't automatic. And so that stopping, that pause, was a moment that helped me remember that I was being intentional about being careful not to take God's name in vain. And I think that sense of holiness and sacredness and the wonder and splendor, the awe of the divine is worth remembering in our everyday language. And pronouns are a way to do that. And I also think that now may be the time for us to start a new practice. If we want to use pronouns about God, we can't use he, we can't use she. Those are too limiting. Perhaps now is the time to start using that awkward practice of the singular they. Because God is not plural, but God contains more than one expression. We know that that's true about humans. And we're trying our best to be accepting of others by using that awkward, clunky language when people request us to use those pronouns for them. And if we can show that kind of compassion and love for our neighbor, then it's time we should expand that and understand how divine that love is and do the same in our language about God. Now, I understand that in the incarnation, in our story as we believe that God became flesh, became one of us, that the flesh that God inhabited was male. And we use pronouns to refer to Jesus as he, and that makes sense. I do wonder, though, about the resurrected Christ, if those limiting pronouns make sense. I also wonder about the incarnation. Did it happen just in that moment? Is there such a unique moment in history that that's the only expression of God's presence with us, God's love in our lives? Surely that's not the case. That's not to say that the life and death and resurrection of Jesus and our understanding of the Christ in our presence and the Spirit of God, which, by the way, is sometimes referred to as female when you look at the language. I'm not saying that any of that is any less unique or unimportant. But surely God comes to us still. And surely God came and was with the people before God came in the incarnation in Jesus. In fact, a lot of Jesus' ministry is pointing out what people should already know. If you have the eyes to see and the ears to hear, if you have the understanding in your being, you already know this. It's a lot of what Jesus had to say. And part of that reason is that the story is rich with God's presence among the people. We get that in this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. When they choose to go into the fire, instead of prostrating themselves before any earthly idol or power, they trust that God will be with them. And the story tells us that God is in a physical form. There is an incarnation in the fire. God appears. And we don't know what that form is. Maybe it was Jesus. Maybe it was a pre-existing occurrence of the bodily appearance of God as Jesus. We don't know that. They wouldn't have known that, would they? Because they hadn't met him yet. But I don't think that's what matters. I think what matters in the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is that they understood themselves to be people of God who could lean on and trust God. And this is not just about worshiping God without fear. It is that. But I think that's just scratching the surface of this story. There are a number of important takeaways to this story that we should consider. First, we should understand that there is strength in solidarity, that we don't have to go it alone. It's not the story of Shadrach. It's not the story of Meshach. It's not the story of Abednego. It's the story of all three, and a fourth. It's about finding that strength in togetherness, that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And we have that when we have faith, and we are in solidarity with one another around issues that matter, about issues of identity, about issues of oppression. And that's the second takeaway, that there is something very godly about standing up to injustice and oppression, that this is holy work. This is the work of God's people, to stand up to oppression, to stand up to injustice and fight for a better way, even if it might involve sacrifice even to the point of laying down our own lives. That is Christ's way. And when we stand up to oppression, injustice, to tyranny in the world, when we have that sort of faith, then we also have a promise of change. We may or may not see it in our lifetimes, but we can see it in the story, in the history. We can trust here that God sees beyond our limited lifetimes and our limited abilities and power, and does more and greater than we can do alone. And that is why we have one another in solidarity. That's why we are never alone, even in the fire, with those who choose to go with us. Our God is present. And that, my friends, is a gift of our faith. And in this moment in our history, in this country, in this time, we have a choice to make. Will we walk into the fire? Not the fire that's prepared necessarily for us, for we may be the allies, not the victims. And so we have a choice, and it's an important one. Do we believe in the power of solidarity? Do we believe that standing up to oppression and injustice is holy work? And do we believe that God's going to do something about it? Or are we just hoping that maybe God will fix it without us, that we might walk away? You see, at this very moment in this country, it's not some King Nebuchadnezzar who is imposing his will on the people. It is the people choosing. And there are sides here that are very important to understand which one we're on. And if we are silent, we are choosing the side whichever wins. And the one that is currently winning is unjust, is oppressive. There are more than 500 laws being proposed or already passed in this country trying to limit the rights of transgender folks, try to take away gender-affirming care that is truly life-giving. Because, you see, there are those who think that what's happening is grooming of children, trying to turn straight children into queer children. But the truth of the matter is that this is about trying to not turn queer children into dead children. Suicide among transgender folks is exceedingly high, way above the norm. And most of the hate crimes in this country that end in death are murders of transgender people. There's something at its core that is unholy and evil in what is happening. And if we say nothing, then we are watching our queer siblings go into the fire. And yes, they will be met with their God. And this God will not be happy with us if we did nothing to prevent it. We must speak up. We must act. Our voices matter, especially in a country that is a democracy still, where we have a say in what happens. Yes, there is a place and a time for a conversation about fairness in women's sports. And yes, there is a time and a place for a conversation about who uses what restroom. Because there will be those who will exploit it. You can always find an example of something that's unfair. You can find an example of someone who is a predator and assaulting women in their bathrooms. But now is not that time. Now is not the time while our queer siblings are suffering and literally dying. We must address that first. We must say, let us protect those who are least able to protect themselves, who are most vulnerable. Let us speak up. Let us stand up. Let us stand in the way and make a safe space. Once that is established, we can talk about the fringe and the outliers, the examples of stories here and there. Because people still will care about fairness and justice once we establish justice for all. Let's begin by refusing to other. Let us begin by appreciating that there is no they, in the sense that there's no outsider, there is no other, there is only we. We are all in this together. Maybe the pronoun we most need to embrace is we, us. And then we can appreciate that God is they, them, and that their presence among us is the gift that we most need. And we will most find it amongst God's people. And let's try to keep us out of the fire, shall we? Thank you for walking this far with us on this journey on the Marginal Way. I hope that along the way you've picked up a gift or two. And I hope that you understand how gifts are meant to be reciprocal and that you are prepared to give. Perhaps one way you could give is by liking this video, by sharing this video that others might walk this way with us. And you could subscribe to our channel. That helps us tremendously. If you have the financial means, offering a gift to our ministry so that we might continue to serve those on the margins of our community would be a big help. You can visit our website and do exactly that. Now, I said I would share some thoughts about Pride. I'm not real excited about Pride Month for a couple of reasons. There are things I don't like about it. For one, I'm sorry that it's called Pride, because people take swipes at it for that. Because they hear pride as arrogance instead of pride as dignity, what's necessary to counter the shame that has been brought forth by society. So it's not inappropriate, but it is a difficulty, isn't it? I'm also sorry that it's just a month, because we shouldn't do this just for a period of time and then forget about it for the rest of the time. It needs to be life-changing, this way that we reach out and care for one another. And finally, I'm just sorry that it exists at all. Why is that? Because it shouldn't have to. Why should we have to remind ourselves, instruct ourselves, and tell one another to be decent, to do the right thing, to accept one another, to truly believe that there is no they, it's all we. We are in this together. And so I hope you hold that in your heart. I hope that as you go forth from this time, wherever you go, whatever you do, that you will remember that you are not alone, that your God walks with you, because your God is present in and among all of us. Go in peace, my friends.
You with the sad eyes, don't be discouraged, oh I realize it's hard to take courage in a world full of people. You can lose sight of it all, and the darkness inside you can make you feel so small. But I'll see your true colors shining through. I'll see your true colors. That's why I love you. So don't be afraid to let them show your true colors. Your true colors are beautiful like a rainbow. Show me a smile then. Don't be unhappy, can remember when I last saw you laughing. If this world makes you crazy and you've taken all you can bear, you call me up and you know I'll be there. And I'll see your true colors shining see your true colors. That's why I love you, so don't be afraid to let them show your true colors. Your true colors are beautiful, like a rainbow. Who can remember when I last saw you laughing? If this world makes you crazy and you've taken all you can bear, you call me up and I know I'll be there, and I'll see your true colors shining through. I'll see your true colors. That's why I love you, so don't be afraid to let them show your true colors, your true